Welcome to Hub Hits. I'm Harrison Lowman, managing editor of The Hub. Today I am joined by a very special guest. He is Canada's former ambassador to China, Mr. David Mulroney. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, Harrison. How are you?
I'm good. We're having you here for interesting times because we have a news hook. Last week, in his first ever talks with Chinese leadership, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his Chinese counterpart agreed to, and I'm quoting here, regularize channels of communication. And then only moments ago, we hear that former Finance Minister Bill Morneau at a conference in Hong Kong says that we should also be strengthening ties with China to hedge against the U.S. You've written for us, David, in our pages. You said China is already alive to the opportunity that a Trump-induced crisis offers for recapturing hearts and minds in the West. So I ask you, how have the Chinese been doing at capturing hearts and minds these days?
Well, one thing they do is they enjoy putting a little bit of pressure on you in terms of trade. And we've been at daggers drawn over trade issues with tariffs on both sides because then you can lift them. And so they're offering to sit down with the Prime Minister or his representatives and discuss lifting those trade limits. So that gets everybody's attention in Ottawa, and everybody starts talking about engaging China. And wouldn't China be a nice way, a nice replacement for the United States? All ideas that are not particularly real or valuable, but it drives people in the direction that China wants to go.
So the olive branch has a money sign on it, is what you're saying.
Exactly. And China's long-term objective for countries like Canada, middle powers that are prosperous, have things that China wants, is to, over time, split them away from their friendship and the patronage of the United States. And when I wrote a book about my time in China more than 10 years ago, that seemed far-fetched but possible. And now it's absolutely clear that is what China seeks to do.
And the U.S. has been helping them do it, with 51st state talk and this sort of thing. It's kind of, grease the wheels, would you say?
Very much so. And what's really interesting is the 51st state talk, which is unhelpful and disrespectful and problematic for a lot of reasons, prompted Canadians to say we're going to get our elbows up. Where they should have their elbows up is with China, because China is far more of a problem and far more capable of getting a degree of control and influence in Canadian society that the United States could only dream of. And the United States wouldn't dream of it because it's highly coercive and behind the scenes. So China sees its opportunity and it's working towards it. And it's also doing this, of course, with Europe and Australia and others.
Well, this is the thing. I think, so they've made headway with Spain and the EU, you write. In Britain, I note the Chancellor said recently it would be very foolish not to engage. We're in the midst of a trade war. Just to remind people the context that comes here, 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs here in Canada, 25% tariffs on Chinese aluminum and steel. China's come after us in the form of canola oil, meal, seafood.
Pork, I think, is
pork as well. I say this at the same time. You mentioned threats. Prime Minister Mark Carney, when he was merely a leader of the Liberal Party in the leaders' debate, was asked, what's the biggest security threat to Canada? And he answered, what, David?
He answered China.
Yeah. So is your thinking that, so far those are just words? There's not sort of substantive action behind that, acknowledging that threat?
Absolutely, because we've got Canada and the person of the Prime Minister indicating that it's time to re-engage with China. And by the way, that headline is probably, Canada to seek to repair relations with China is one of the most used headlines in Canadian history. There should be a ... again after it. But that's not really what's happening here. I mean, we engaging with China should begin with a really serious consideration of Canadian security. We had an inquiry into Chinese interference. It was a particularly incurious inquiry and not a particularly ambitious one, but it came up with some ideas, such as a very good one that we have a registry of foreign agents. We haven't done any of that. So I'm appalled that the Prime Minister and senior officials would talk about engaging China without first having put that in place. Have we learned nothing?
Well, this is what I'm thinking. So the commissioner of the public inquiry you mentioned identified China as the foremost aggressor when it comes to foreign interference in Canada. So for you, David, for there to be re-engagement, all this diplomatic speak, what would the table stakes need to be for you Let's say if you were in the ambassador role right now, to be able to then advise the government and say, okay, listen, they're ready to play ball here, they're serious, and they've done what's need to be done to actually engage?
For me, the table stakes are quite small because we tend to confuse business and China buying things that it needs with being friendly to China or making an apology for being upset that China kidnapped 2 Canadian citizens. All these things.
Let's not forget that.
China seeks to obtain this from us for the privilege of being able to do business with China. It's not a privilege. And here's a little example. We are now in the really, really wonderful position of having more than the United States as a buyer for our oil. Why? Because we finished the Trans Mountain Pipeline in China. China still takes about 10% and the United States about 90%. But it was an example of diversification that didn't depend on bending the knee or going to Beijing cap in hand. We simply got the infrastructure built. If we focused more on the nuts and bolts of getting products to market efficiently, we can deliver what China needs. China, at the end of the day, can be political on some things, and unfortunately, canola is one of those things it's frequently political about. It can force the people in China who really want to buy Canadian canola because it's a much better product, it can force them to keep their mouth shut and buy an inferior product. But things like energy...
And they'll listen.
And they'll listen because they have to listen. And they did this to us for a long time on tourism. Even though Chinese people wanted to come and see Canada, we didn't get the go-ahead for many, many years, while Australia and New Zealand got it before us. So the Chinese government can take a lot of pain from its consumers and the citizens of China in ways that we can't. The other thing that we have, which is surfacing again, is we've got premiers who can't take any pain and will put a great deal of pressure on the federal government to do things that really aren't in our interest to get a deal with China. So
will you name names? I know there's been certain premiers that have come out and said
I can think
things.
Of one in the Midwest that hasn't been particularly, not Alberta and not Manitoba, that hasn't always been helpful. And I get the pain, I get the, why they're raising their voices now, but for all the talk about Team Canada, it means sometimes doing difficult things and accepting difficult decisions.
Your detractors, which I know you hear a lot from on Twitter, would say something like this. What do you propose, David? We remain in a forever trade war with diplomatic channels frozen as well forever, and not engaging with the second biggest economy in the world. And one of two, largest superpowers in the world, the other one not being that pleased with us as well. That we should remain in some sort of stasis? We know that they're not going to change on some of these issues. I think that's apparent. So where should we exist now in the present?
What I'd say is, what do you mean by engagement? Mm-hmm. This is a really woolly word, and it's invoked all the time, saying we've got to engage China, and China's now prepared to re-engage with us. It doesn't really mean anything to China. China doesn't want to be our friend, doesn't see us as a friend, doesn't respect us. China seeks to influence us, and it'll do that overtly with tariffs and economic measures, but it will do it covertly, and it will do it increasingly covertly.
Give us a sense of the coercive practices you've talked about
before. Coercive trade, this is not the first time that China has held us hostage, and it has done this to other countries as well. When Norway awarded the Nobel Prize, or the Nobel Prize was awarded in Norway to a great champion of human rights, China for several years blocked imports of Norwegian salmon. It takes trade actions to punish countries for doing things that countries would normally do. So it's coercive in that sense, but it's also coercive in the sense of putting pressure on the Chinese diaspora in Canada, punishing, harassing relatives of Uyghurs, the Muslim people who are now basically interned in Western China, doing it to people from Hong Kong, from places, Tibet. So it's active. Its diplomatic offices also operate clandestine networks. When I was still in government, I had to, for my sins, go to Chinese National Day and other events. And even then, and this is more than 10 years ago, I was struck by the fact that the Chinese consul general, much less the Chinese ambassador, but the consul general in Vancouver or Toronto, would be greeted as a kind of political figure who had power. People would be lining up to shake his hand and kiss his ring, seek his notice. And it wasn't just the regular guests. Canadian politicians would be there bowing and scraping. I used to wonder why the mayor of Markham, Ontario, would participate in a raising of the Chinese flag on the morning of Chinese National Day. This is the same flag that flies over the gulags in Western China. So we cede territory and authority to the Chinese state by being craven. What we need to do is engage China with our eyes open. We want to do business with China, yes. There are some things in terms of health and education where we need to cooperate. But beyond that, we don't need to risk our own security to have China like us or occasionally forgive us for our misdeeds. If we want to be a brave middle power that is autonomous and is now stepping away from the United States, let's first step away from China. Let's learn how to do it. And then let's think very carefully about what the United States means to us. It's not China. It's a very different place. And we need to work out a relationship with it that would never be possible with China.
Mm-hmm. A lot of Canadians are warming to China, at least as it relates to economic issues. I'm looking at a Nanos poll from late April that found 31% of Canadians now support increasing the trade relationship with China. In June 2023, David, it was 7%. So what's your message to Canadians who feel that, when compared to what they see as, autocratic, tariff-fueled moves that Trump is making, China doesn't seem that bad? That they're not all that different, and hey, at least they aren't threatening to annex us. I know the Chinese ambassador recently said, trying to pull us forward, we respect Canada's sovereignty. What's your message to these Canadians whose views are changing seemingly over the course of a few months, wanting those further economic ties to China?
I'm not against doing business with China, but I think we need to increasingly do it with our eyes open to problems and to the kind of coercion that China can apply on things like canola. This is the third or fourth boycott of Canadian canola. Seafood is also regularly targeted, as are meat products and sometimes wood products. So we have to accept the fact that there's China risk. It's not a panacea. And there will be times when we inevitably have to do things that are going to cost us a trade dispute with China. So let's continue to diversify. And let's also take a leaf from the Australian book. And the Australians have been punished by China. There's been commercial retaliation, but its big exports, the things that China needs, coal and iron ore, are often left untouched. So think about what China really needs. Think about interdependence with China and diversify. If we understand the importance of diversifying from the United States, China's not where we go first. It's not the haven. We need to diversify from China as well. And let's also remember that our exports to China are much smaller than they are to the United States. By the way, we have a significant trade deficit with China. They sell us three times as much as we sell them. So we've got some leverage there. Let's keep looking at the rest of the world. Let's work on our infrastructure. Had we done the deals with Japan and Germany that were proposed in the last couple of years and we said no to, this conversation would be a little different too. We need to think about what our strengths are when it comes to resources, energy, and minerals, and understand that that's the key to our middle power autonomy. If we don't do that, then we're pretty well stuck. If we do focus on that and really get out there to global markets, make ourselves far more competitive than we are now, I think we're going to be just fine.
Two final questions for you. You mentioned being stuck. If we do increase ties, economic, cultural, diplomatic, etc., what does that look like? Looking at that word stuck, with further ties increasing between Canada and China, how does that manifest itself? What does it do to Canada?
It manifests itself in a lot of activities that are kind of delusional. So we had a Canada-China parliamentary caucus. China doesn't have a parliament. It has a National People's Congress that is a rubber stamp institution. Pretending that China has democratic institutions just misleads Canadians and misguides them. It gets us involved in areas of research and technology exchange that are now increasingly problematic and possibly dangerous to our national security. We don't have a lot of scope for broadening the relationship beyond where it is now. Want to have tourists come to Canada, that's fine. People are interested in Chinese cultural products, that's fine. But we don't do any of that before we do the very basic things that the Hogue inquiry told us to do and that we urgently need to do. As we saw even in the last election, which was after the inquiry, The Liberals had problems with candidates in one riding in particular, where one candidate made jokes about the Chinese bounty on Democrats from Hong Kong, and he was replaced with someone who himself had a problematic history when it came to his relationships with China and with organizations that China uses to co-opt people.
Just lastly, G7 in a few days, being held in Alberta. What do you hope the conversations look like around China there when, some of the most powerful world leaders meet around the table?
I hope that there's a degree of China realism and that we don't lose the momentum and distance that we had gained over time in the last 5 years or so as countries began to wean themselves off of the kind of China madness. The UK was probably in the lead in that score, and they're not moving in the right direction now. So if we could all agree to a more sensible approach to China, that'd be great, but I don't have my hopes up.
You're not an optimistic man. An optimist. You never have been. That is Canada's former ambassador to China, Mr. David Mulroney. Please visit the Hub, www.thehub.ca. Give David's articles a read. Give what else is on the Hub website a read. And if you like what you see, why not sign up to be a free member? We'd love to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.